That must have been one good steak, because that's what he remembered. He said that was a great environment because he was eating steak. Joining me now is Jonna Spilbor, defense attorney. How are you, Jonna, this afternoon? Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Thanks, Vincent.
So we heard about the steak, obviously. We heard about the drinking that was going on. But one of the things that I picked up on here during that, as everyone was leaving, you just heard Mr. Stringer say everyone hugged, they kissed, everything seemed fine. So here we are, it's 9:15, 9:30, and then just a short time later, Diane McIver is shot. She's transported to the hospital, and the prosecution is saying, well, this was all intentional. It was for this money. But you just heard one of the witnesses, a friend of the victim, say everyone was happy, they were in love, seemed everything was okay. So how do we go from that to an hour later, Diane is shot in Texas, this prime suspect of this brutal murder?
You know, isn't it going to be such a big leap? Because the prosecution wants to convince the jury that, you know, there was not only a financial motive, but they weren't getting along that well. And we need to give the jury a reason to convict if that's what they're going to do. And so you need to provide those reasons step by step. But here, if the prosecution wants to claim that this couple was not getting along so well, or they were in a heated argument, or I don't know, maybe that one of them was really drunk, it's going to fall short, because according to this witness, this was business as usual. We had a nice steak dinner. We played golf. We hugged and kissed. We went home. Period. End of story.
Right. And, you know, not only did he mention the steak, again, it must have been one heck of a steak, but he mentioned the golf earlier that day. Diane was a great golfer. Everyone was drinking wine. He didn't know who was drinking sweet tea. So to me, if I'm the prosecution and I'm talking to this guy, I'm asking this guy questions, I'm in the back of my head thinking, oh, my God, he is not a witness that I probably should have called, because it doesn't paint this picture of Tex being this crazed guy that wanted to get out of paying this bill. What say you?
I agree with that. It's almost as if, I mean, he's doing a better job for the defense, because he's just painting a normal picture. Probably everybody on that jury can relate to having dinner with friends, being, you know, having no argument whatsoever with their spouse, getting up and going home. Nobody expects to end up dead. And that fits squarely within the defense camp, because their theory of this case, with which I agree, is that this was just a horrific accident.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, up to the jury, but I mean, there's so much here to say that this very well could have been an accident, especially the way Diane was shot and where she was shot inside that vehicle. We're actually going to toss to a quick break. We have more to come on the Claud Tex McIver case. The testimony's heating up in the courtroom. Stay tuned. Don't go away. Okay, there you have it. Alan Stringer saying Tex McIver asked him, did he repeat, or what did he tell the police? Jonna, what do you take of this? I mean, he says he's at McDonald's. You know, they had just played some golf, and now he's talking about, hey, did you tell them how much alcohol I had that night? What do you take of that?
You know, here's what I take of it. Tex McIver is a lawyer. Something terrible just happened.
Right.
And he's responsible for it. I'm not saying that he's criminally responsible for it. If it turns out that this is an accident in the eyes of the jury, he's responsible. There was a gun in his hand, the trigger went off, his wife is dead. But because he's been a trained lawyer and he's no spring chicken, he's been practicing law for a long time, these questions are going to come up, and I think it's almost natural. I mean, look, you know, I'm a lawyer, and people often accuse me of being a lawyer, you know, even in my downtime, and sometimes that's not fun, and I think Tex McIver was doing the same thing. He's asking the normal questions that a legal brain would be asking under the circumstances.
I couldn't say I agree more. There was actually a witness to this shooting, let's not forget, and that was Danny Jo Carter. She was actually the driver of that vehicle. Let's listen to Danny Jo's testimony right now. All right, that was Danny Jo Carter. She was the driver of the vehicle where Diane McIver was shot by Tex McIver. And Jonna, you and I were talking during this segment here, and the prosecution kept bringing up this alcohol and the drinking. And listen, I like to partake in a little wine here and there. There's probably some in my fridge right now. What does that have to do with anything with what happened inside that vehicle and that gun going off?
You know, that is a fantastic question, because as he's asking the questions about the alcohol, I'm scratching my head going, and so what? I mean, because
Right.
the allegation isn't that somebody was stinking drunk, whether it be Tex, whether it be his wife. Like, that allegation is not there. And frankly, between me and you, if, say, Tex McIver was a little tipsy, that would almost help him in one sense, at least against a charge of murder,
Exactly.
because he would lack, not that he would lack the intent, but it makes the incident more reckless than it does intentional. And then second of all, I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. The prosecution seemed to, for a split second, try to make it sound like Tex McIver directed his wife into the front passenger seat, and that would be a step towards intent. But this witness, Danny Jo, quickly shot that down. She basically said, no, they tossed me the keys and said, you drive. Maybe Diane was uncomfortable driving because she had a glass of wine. I mean, nobody wants to drive drunk. But it didn't look like it was a pre-planned Tex McIver making his wife sit in the front seat because he knew later on that day he was going to take the gun and shoot her in the back. It's not that at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard case to present, that this was all intentional. I mean, you look at the entire day: golfing, dinner, drinks, laughing, kissing, saying goodbye. It's a huge case to try to present. We're actually going to take a quick break and get more of the Claud Tex McIver case out of Atlanta, the attorney accused of shooting his wife in the back. Stay tuned. Okay, still hearing testimony from Danny Jo Carter. Again, she was the driver the night that Diane McIver was shot by her husband, Tex McIver, who says it was an accident. Now, things got very interesting here, Jonna. She said that she got off the exit here to try to avoid some construction, some traffic. Listen, I spend a lot of time in Atlanta, about 50% of my time in Atlanta. I know traffic gets really bad. And Tex says, hey, ladies, this is a bad neighborhood. You shouldn't have done this. Can you please at least hand me my gun? And I got to be honest, I carry a gun when I'm in Atlanta. I'm licensed to carry it. There's a few parts of the city where, honestly, I do take my gun out of the holster and maybe put it down in the center console so I can get to it quickly. So to say that this was an intentional act, again, I'm just not there yet based on what the prosecution is saying. I'm not there. What about you?
I think a defense attorney could really make some hay with that point and say to the jury, listen, he didn't ask for his gun the moment he got in the car.
Right.
He certainly didn't direct his wife to sit in the front seat in front of him, right? I don't even know if he's the one who I don't think he was the one who handed the keys to Danny Jo. He did not reach for that gun or obtain that gun until he felt in some sort of, in his mind, reasonable fear. Now, it might not have been a reasonable fear, but that's not even the point. The point is, if you're going to try to prove that this man committed some sort of premeditated murder, had planned to kill his wife, he's not going to wake up, look around and say, oh, now give me the gun because we're in a bad neighborhood. He wasn't even behind the wheel. If he had orchestrated this, he would have said, Danny Jo, I want you to take a right, take a left, take a right. Oh, now we're in a bad neighborhood. Let me have the gun. That did not happen, Vincent.
Right, and not only that, there's a few things that always stuck out here, to me at least. A, if I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do it in front of someone, especially a friend of my wife's. And B, right, I don't think I would shoot through that seat simply because there's a lot of metal, there's a lot of moving parts in that seat. There's no guarantee that she would have been shot. I mean, if this was an intentional thing and Diane was shot in the back of her head, you can see the diagram there on your screen. No question it would be an intentional thing if she was shot in the back of the head. But again, you have a witness, you have a bullet that's trying to go through this seat, as you just saw on your screen, to strike his wife. There was no guarantee that that was going to happen. So I don't understand how the prosecution is telling this jury that this was an intentional thing to get out of this money. I think it just could have gone down so many other ways.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it just seems like a really crazy, sort of ignorant way to try to kill somebody. Now, look, you and I are never going to intentionally commit a murder, so it's really hard to get inside a murderer's head.
Right.
I think Tex McIver set out to kill his wife that night. And if he didn't set out to kill his wife that night, then your only other conclusion is that this was a horrific accident.
Yeah, to suggest that he set out that night, I think the entire day would have gone different. I don't think they would have been on the golf course. I definitely don't think they would have been at Longhorns having steak and drinks with all of these friends.
Imagine what planning to kill your wife all day would have done to your game, right? Nobody's going to do that.
Right. Now, listen, I'm not a golfer other than putt-putt, but you're right. It would probably mess up your game. And I'm sure someone would have throughout that day said, hey, man, are you okay? Because you look a little troubled. It looks like there's something on your mind. I don't think you can actually go through the entire day planning to kill your wife and no one pick up on any emotion. You know, we heard that nurse talk earlier that said he was emotionless in the emergency room. But, you know, if you're planning this all day, I think it would show definitely on your face that you're planning to kill your wife. So we're actually going to take a quick break here and come back with more of the Claud Tex McIver case. Again, an attorney in Atlanta who is accused of killing his wife intentionally for $350,000. Stay tuned on the Law&Crime Network. All right, thank you, Anthony, as always. We want to get back to the courtroom in Atlanta and hear more from Danny Jo Carter. Take a listen. Yeah, so it looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties there. Jonna, are you still with me? Hey, so we've been hearing this testimony from Danny Jo Carter. Again, she was the driver of this vehicle. And on that night, she says, hey, we're just driving around. We get off the wrong exit. It's traffic. It's congested. Tex wakes up and says, hey, we're in a bad neighborhood. Hand me the gun. And we were talking before the break that, again, it's hard to say this was intentional. Like, he didn't have the gun on him previously. You know, he didn't say as soon as he got in the car, hand me the gun. And to your point, he didn't say, take a left here, take a right here, take a left there. And again, there's so many other ways he could have made it look like a carjacking, anything. But to say, well, he shoots her through this metal seat with the chance of the bullet not even hitting the target, I'm still kind of like, maybe it was a horrible accident.
Oh, yeah, I'm squarely on that side because so far the prosecution really hasn't hit a home run, Vincent. They really have. Even with, if you go back to the financial motive, I got to tell you, like, loans between spouses, money exchanges between spouses, people who aren't planning to get divorced, and you really can't. They weren't living in a box. These people were well off. I don't think it's an uncommon thing that a spouse is going to lend another spouse money. Maybe for tax purposes, it would show up better as a loan than as a gift. I don't know. I'm not their accountant. I don't see that as a big motivating factor. It wasn't like she was kicking him to the curb with no place to live. Yeah,
absolutely. And listen, I've been married twice, and I've given them both money, and yet they're still alive. So am I, thankfully, for right now. But, yeah, again, it doesn't really paint the picture for motive here, in my opinion. I think we have the clip up of Danny Jo Carter, so let's hear more of her testimony. All right, so that was some pretty crucial testimony there by Danny Jo Carter. Again, she was the driver the night Diane McIver was shot in the back by her husband, Tex. Now, Jonna, she was talking about the route that she took and some very important things there. She saw some people that could have been homeless. We heard the defense object to that, but she said there were some cardboard boxes, and it was more like a social gathering. So, yes, it could have been some homeless people there. But one thing I found interesting, and again, I spent a lot of time in Atlanta. I moved there in 2011, and she said, I didn't even know that was Piedmont Hospital, and that was one of the things that the prosecution pointed out. Oh, you passed the hospital. Oh, he did this on purpose. But she didn't even realize that was Piedmont Hospital. And I got to tell you, I couldn't tell you where a lot of the hospitals in the Atlanta area are, other than Grady, simply because I see it when I'm on the interstate. But if you tell me to get to Piedmont or something like that, I'm probably going to have to GPS it out. So, again, I'm not quite there that, you know, Tex had this elaborate plan to shoot his wife in the back, but then, oh, don't take her to the closest hospital. Let's go to the furthest one, blah, blah, blah. Because she didn't even know herself. She's the driver. She's from the area. She didn't know it was Piedmont Hospital. So are you there yet that this was this intentional act?
You know, procedurally, this feels like, and I don't know the prosecutors here, but it really almost feels like novices put together the case on behalf of the prosecution, because I keep waiting for, and I'm sure the jury box keeps waiting for, make a point that actually gives me something to sink my teeth into at the end of the day. And they keep calling witnesses who are equally as beneficial, or should I just say kind of neutral for both sides. I mean, Danny Jo is not giving anybody a smoking gun, no pun intended. She's not doing that. The prior witnesses haven't done that. I don't think that there has been and again, I'm not making a pun, a smoking gun, an aha moment, a Perry Mason moment yet in this trial.
Right, and you mentioned the smoking gun. I'm glad you brought that up, because you heard the prosecution ask, where was the gun at this point? And she says, I don't know where the gun was at this point. So, again, we can't prove that Tex had it in his hand and he's just looking around and waiting for the right moment to go ahead and pull that trigger. We can't come to that conclusion. But I think what the prosecution is hoping that they can start saying this 350,000, this 350,000, and she didn't get to the hospital on time, and this whole thing about, because you heard Rucker, the prosecutor, say, well, did you see people protesting there? Because that was one of the accounts that Tex McIver gave. So he's sitting here trying to discredit and paint this picture, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a murderer, that you intended to kill your wife.
Right. It's kind of a stretch. The points that the prosecution is trying to make are really a stretch. You take Danny Jo for a minute. She is friendly with both of them. She has known them for a long time. Now, I can imagine if it's my friend and I'm driving a car and something happens, she could actually be motivated to want somebody to pay, and that somebody would be Tex McIver. But Danny Jo is a good witness in a sense. Look at her demeanor. She is just very matter of fact. She's not pounding her fist on the table. She's not trying to embellish her story, as a lot of witnesses try to do when they're trying to make a point. She is as honest as they come. When the jury is going to assess her at the end of the day, that woman is very credible.
Yeah, she's very credible, and she's the only basic eyewitness to this case. Of course, I don't believe she would have seen the actual shot because she was, of course, driving. We would assume that she would have to turn her head and actually see that when it happened. You can see on your screen that Diane was being wheeled into the hospital there with Tex following close behind his wife right after this happened and right after they arrived to the hospital. We're going to go to a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network and have more of the Tex McIver case. Again, he is on trial right now for the murder of his wife. The prosecution says this was all about money that he could not pay back his wife, $350,000. But again, it's up to the jury. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network. We'll be right back. All right, so that was some pretty visual testimony there from Danny Jo Carter. You see that the prosecution actually brought in real-life replica seats from this Ford Expedition that Tex McIver owned. You can see the demonstration there on your screen. Jonna, what do you think that did for the jury to actually be able to see these seats with these attorneys there? I think it was a bit much. I think they could have done the exact same thing with just some simple chairs to position where people were seated there. But the problem that I have here, at least for me, is there's no guarantee that Tex sat in that back seat by design. Maybe Diane said, hey, I want to ride up front. We don't know that. We don't know if it was Tex's plan to sit in the back of that SUV directly behind his wife. And maybe he sat behind her because maybe Danny Jo had the seat too far back and he wanted extra leg room. We don't know. But what do you think it did to the jury to be able to see these seats and to see this attorney sitting there and turning around like Danny Jo described it?
I have a big problem with it, and here's why. It's one thing, Vincent, if you, as prosecutor or defense attorney, want to bring in seats to a car, front of a mattress, any sort of, prop to do a demonstration. That's one thing. Here's how you do it. You bring it in, you do your demonstration. Your witness now goes back on the witness stand. When he made Danny Jo reenact what they allege happened that night, and she had to sit in that driver's seat and turn her head and look, and the jury got to be trained on her sitting in what they believed was a driver's seat of a car, not just to do a demonstration, no, but to give the rest of her testimony, I think was a bit much. I think it's unfair. It could be prejudicial. They should have just done a demonstration and then moved her back into the witness stand. That's how it's typically done. But if I can also complain, can I complain about one more thing?
Absolutely.
She doesn't even know her friend got shot. When this happened, listen, I'm a gun owner too. And whenever I'm shooting my gun, I have headphones on and it's still loud. She's in a closed compartment, obviously no headphones. When that blast goes off, all their hearts must have jumped out of their chest, right? That's very startling. So
Yeah.
she didn't realize her friend got shot. Her friend
Right.
is talking.
And
Again, this doesn't help the prosecution.
And not only that, I'm sorry, Jonna, she said she thought there was a bullet hole in the floor. We're going to tell us to a quick break. We'll have more of the Tex McIver case in Atlanta. Stay tuned on the Law and Crime Network. Hey, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Just before the break, we were hearing testimony from Danny Jo Carter. She was the driver of that vehicle, and you saw they did a recreation in the courtroom of the car. She was actually doing her testimony there. And Jonna Spilbor, you made a good point. She actually said something that's very interesting here that she says Tex said. Could you tell that to our viewers?
Yeah, this may be subtle, but to me it's big. When the gunshot went off, she turned around and she said that Tex said the gun discharged. Notice he didn't say, oh my God, I shot my wife. The gun discharged. And when you're familiar with guns and you work with guns, there is a big difference to me saying the gun discharged versus, oh my God, I shot my wife.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's not a term I would use, and I've been shooting for like 30 years between the military and the police. You know, if it's a discharge, it was an accident. If I pulled the trigger intentionally, I would say I shot, and there you can see the gun actually there on the screen. We want to get back into the courtroom and hear more testimony from Danny Jo Carter. All right, so there you have it. I mean, she said she asked Tex where the closest emergency room was, and it's not like Tex McIver like pretended not to know or didn't answer the question. Maybe he was just going on what he knew. And Jonna, the prosecution here said, hey, when this happened, what did Diane say? Well, you shot me, Tex. Well, did you say anything? No. Did Tex say anything? No. But if you think about it, you just shot your wife. He said the gun discharged. He may have just been in a state of shock where he couldn't get those words out immediately to actually say something. So to me, it really doesn't mean anything that he didn't say anything at that exact moment. What say you?
I agree with that, because we now know, based on Danny Jo's testimony, even the victim didn't realize she got shot,
Right.
which is also common. So I think in that vehicle, especially Tex, knowing that the gun discharged, was probably hoping that if it hit anybody, it didn't fatally hit anybody, and there was a state of shock inside that vehicle for a few seconds. Completely natural. Again, doesn't prove any sort of premeditation.
Yeah, and you heard Danny Jo say she thought it was a joke, but then she realized it wasn't. And in her previous testimony, she said she thought there was a bullet hole in the floor of the truck because she said that's where the gun was pointing when she turned around to actually see it. So we want to get back in the courtroom and hear more of Danny Jo Carter. Take a listen. All right, still hearing testimony from Danny Jo Carter. And Jonna, I got to play devil's advocate here, all right? Her friend was just shot in this car, and the prosecution is asking, hey, were you driving reckless? No, I was driving normal to make sure she wasn't hurt. And we can't say how we would react in that situation. You know, would we speed? Would we drive reckless? And to her point, I mean, if you drive reckless, you get in an accident, then what? You can't get her to the hospital. So I really don't see where this line of questioning is going. Like, did you think to turn left to go through this neighborhood to get to Piedmont Hospital faster? I really don't see the point, other than the prosecution trying to plant that seed that Tex wanted his wife to die before she got to the hospital. That's the only thing I can think of here.
Yeah, it's another one of those circumstances where there aren't any dots to connect with this line of questioning. And I'm with you. I mean, she's going to be driving, and we don't know what we would have done in that. We probably just would want to get her someplace as soon as possible. And it's not as if Tex McIver was stopping that plan. He didn't say stop the car. He didn't do anything of that nature. So again, when we try to connect these dots and try to prove a premeditation or the intent for a murder, it's broken. It's not working.
Yeah, he certainly didn't put a gun to Diane's head and say, or Danny Jo's head rather, and say, hey, listen, don't go to the hospital. We're going to stop right here. We're going to let her bleed out. Or let's stop right here, call an ambulance and wait. And that was one of the things the prosecution keyed on earlier, that he didn't call 911. He didn't call for an ambulance. But in that situation, even the prosecution himself probably would have done the same thing, because those calls have to be dispatched. to an ambulance. The ambulance has to get there. There's a whole lot that goes into that.
They were the ambulance. They were behind the wheel of a moving car with somebody with a gunshot wound. Go.
Yeah.
That's the ambulance.
Exactly. Because by the time you wait for the ambulance, we don't know what could happen. Again, you see Danny Joe being wheeled into the hospital there as Tex pulls up. You can see he's trying to put his wife there on the gurney as she was shot in the back. There in Atlanta. Again, Tex McIver says it was an accident, but the prosecution says this was all intentional. It was an evil plan by Tex McIver so he wouldn't have to pay back this money that he had borrowed from his wife. We're going to take a quick break, but I assure you the testimony in this case is heating up by Danny Joe. More testimony from Danny Joe when we come back on the other side of this break. Stay tuned. Okay, still listening to Danny Jo Carter. She said she received a text message about Diane's passing. And, Jonna, I want to touch on her previous testimony. She talked about, and it seems like Tex McIver asked her to lie about why she was at the hospital, that she just showed up as a friend. You can see Tex there on your screen to give support. But she said, hey, I can't lie, but I've been playing devil's advocate this entire time. Does that necessarily mean that this was this huge plot by Tex McIver to cover up the fact that he intentionally killed his wife? Or, again, is he an attorney that, hey, he's an attorney, he wants to make sure everything is in order before he starts giving statements to the police?
Well, certainly the prosecution wants everybody to believe that this was a lie, which would give credence to the theory that he had planned to kill her all along. Now, if you break it down a little bit, if he was asking Danny Joe to lie, that's pretty dumb, because they just tooled up to an emergency room with tons of hospital workers. His wife has been shot in the back. To me, that makes no sense. Let's look at the words that Danny Joe actually said. She interpreted him as asking her to lie, but then she says, well, when I said I can't lie, Tex McIver said, I'm not asking you to lie. So do we take the words on face value, ladies and gentlemen of the jury? If I'm arguing on behalf of the defense, I would say yes, we do. This was a chaotic, listen, Vincent, this had to be so chaotic. Danny Joe is very composed because it's much after this event, right, and she's telling the story step by step. When it was happening, everything must have been an excited utterance. People must have been screaming. Minds must have been reeling. It wasn't as calm as it is on this witness stand. Yeah,
and not only that, there were tons of hospital workers, but we saw there was surveillance footage, and everyone knows you go to any hospital these days, there's cameras everywhere. So the fact that Tex would say, oh, just say you came up here as a friend, and to his point, I didn't ask you to lie. Maybe she misinterpreted what he said, or maybe he didn't want to explain the fact that she was driving and he didn't want people to speculate that there was some kind of love triangle or something going on here. We don't know why that statement was made, but the fact that there's tons of cameras there at that hospital, everyone would have seen Danny Joe. You can see it there on your screen. You can see Tex being wheeled in, or Tex walking next to his wife while she's being wheeled in by the nurses there at the hospital. So to say that Tex intentionally asked her to lie is just kind of silly, in my opinion.
And it doesn't make sense, really, I think is even more important. It just doesn't make sense. I think there had to be some sort of misinterpretation there, as you said, that maybe, Tex could be 5 minutes away from getting arrested when he's making these statements to her while his wife is dying. Why? Because a gun in his possession went off. I just can't even imagine what was going through this man's mind at the time.
Yeah, we can't put ourselves in his shoes for sure, because we weren't there. Only Tex, Diane, she's not here, and Danny Joe, and she thought the entire thing was a joke until she realized that her friend was actually shot. She didn't see where the gun was. She said it was pointing to the ground. So there's a lot that we don't know that happened inside that vehicle. Only 3 people know. One's not here to tell that story. Jonna, I know you have to sign off soon, as well as I do, but fear not. Aaron Keller will be here after this next break. And it's a very special weekend, Jonna. I understand your birthday is on Sunday, so I personally want to wish you a happy birthday, as well as all of us here at the Law&Crime Network. So we want you to go out, enjoy your birthday, but I know you'll be right here with us next week, so don't party too hard, okay?
I won't wear a birthday hat when I come to see you in person next week. Thank you for the wish.
You're quite welcome. Again, we've been covering the Claud Tex McIver case in Atlanta. He's an attorney who was on trial for shooting his wife in the back. There you can see him on the screen. The prosecution, of course, said it was about money that he could not repay, up to $350,000. The prosecution said he painted that picture, that Tex McIver came up with this elaborate plan to kill his wife there inside that vehicle. And we saw earlier testimony from Danny Jo Carter. They actually had seats from the vehicle inside the courtroom. You can see the vehicle there, that Ford Expedition, where Dan McIver was shot in the back by her husband, Tex McIver. I will be signing off again. After this break, Aaron Keller with more on the Tex McIver case out of Atlanta. Stay tuned.